Always a pleasure to be at BIF and the opportunity to have the enviable task of summarizing what we heard this morning. I thought it was excellent, excellent speakers and a lot of information to think about. And we've asked our two morning speakers to join me. We're going to have some questions after we do a brief summary here. But as I thought about it, and Dr. Van Eenennaam started us out and talked about gene editing. And as she always does an excellent job taking some really complex, heavy science and making it sound really simple, right? She always does a great job with that. And my take home from that and what I was thinking about is it's another tool in the toolbox. And she used the analogy, it's a cherry on top of the sundae, right? We've got lots of tools. BIF is founded on those tools, and we've got another tool to help us do that. And my thought process went back to yesterday in our general session. How does this new tool, relatively new tool, how can it help us address some of those things that we talked about relative to consumer interests? And Dr. Thompson talked about selling more beef. How does this tool help us do that? We spent a lot of time in BIF in recent years talking about the importance of health traits and genetics related to that. Things like feed efficiency and some of those complex traits that we know are economically relevant and important. But how does gene editing help us solve that? And I think she pointed out we've got some challenges to this point. We've used it for very simple traits like horn, polled, coat color, et cetera. But what's its implications as we move into the quantitative traits? I think another thing that she pointed out that really resonated with me, and I think becomes increasingly a challenge to our industry, is the unfortunate reality that using this technology is not completely up to us. There's a regulatory, and as Alison pointed out, a political slant to this stuff. And so I think it challenges us as an industry and as individuals to become engaged in that process. Not just for gene editing, but for everything that is out there that challenges our industry, become engaged in that process and help the public better understand what we do and how we use science and why we do those things. And those are some take-home messages that I thought Alison brought to us. And as always, I mentioned, does a great job making really, really complicated stuff sound relatively easy. And then we moved into Justin, who I thought did an excellent job in his presentation as well. And he challenged us to think about what we've done in BIF and what we've done as an industry and spent all this time making better cattle genetically. And are we capturing that genetic value? And I hadn't thought about that for a while, Justin. So thanks for the question. And I think the answers that we gave as a crowd I think points out that we've got opportunity there. How do we better capture the genetic value of the cattle that we're producing? And I think we can do better. And so how do we take additional data in the form of using precision tools and turn that into information and help us make better decisions? And think maybe changing our mindset just a little bit from a data standpoint. BIF is founded on the principle that if we're going to change it, we got to measure it, right? If we're going to change it genetically, we've got to have measurement tools to do that. And I think what Justin shared is if we're going to make better cattle from a management and better fit our management and our environment and best capture their value, their genetics and total value and be the most sustainable we can, we've got to have data to help us do that and not just work on the averages. And so I think it fits very well with lots of the principles we've talked about in BIF. And then we had a great panel that took some of those big concepts that Justin talked about and gave us specific examples of precision technology that they're using. And I thought each one of them kind of had a little different slant in terms of doing that. And one thing that resonated with me is very quickly, some of these precision tools fastly, in a very quick fashion, generate lots of data. And I think one of our challenges is how do we take that lots of data? I look at Pat Wall's slides and he just showed a couple calves and their eating behavior. Man, there's a lot of data points in there. And so how do we take those data points and make sense out of it and turn it into something useful that's going to help us capture value and help us do a better job, not only in terms of capturing the genetic merit of those animals, but better managing them and putting them in a better environment. So I thought we had a great session this morning. As always, excellent speakers. Help me one more time and say thank you to them. And then I think we've got a time or two, a little bit, Dr. Loy, for another question or two, if there is any. Any additional questions?
All right. So question, Allison, in the hallway, I had a lot of people coming to me and asked, should we develop policy relative to gene editing in our breed organizations prior to FDA approval? I know there's a lot of discussion on that around the Red Angus table. Would love your both of y'all's opinions on that particular topic.
I think yes, because I think FDA can do what it wants, but the rest of the world's not going to sit around waiting for them to make a decision. And I actually think there's a session this afternoon with Mark Thelman that is in your book, looking at some of these different ideas and how it would be addressed in the in-breed association. So my answer would be yes. I also think it's really important to make sure that you're supportive of the proposed rulemaking, and that's probably more your policy people. I'm looking at you and CBA, wherever you are, because we need to tell the current administration that this is supported by industry and try to get that change enabled. It doesn't change drug applications, as in where you're making an animal to be a pharmaceutical producing thing, but it changes food applications for agriculture, which is you guys. And so I think you guys have a very clear interest in it, and also other countries are going to use this technology and you're going to get left behind.
My question is for Justin, and it's my observation as we've had concentration and consolidation in our industries, that data tends to move into more and more private hands with a recognition of its value, but also a strong desire to keep it proprietary. And therefore, when we take a look at our industry as a whole, we may see progress within individual organizations that's driven by the data and their ability to convert it to information, but not really see that turn into more public information where it's more widely adapted. So I'd like to hear your reaction to that. Do you agree with that? And if so, is there anything we can do about that?
Yeah, so great question. I guess a couple of thoughts around that. In the first aspect of it is I still would firmly say that the data has to have value to you operationally, right? To start with, if as these guys talked about, you know, they're using technology that it generates a lot of data and it had value to each of them at the operational level. And so I think that is the value proposition for each of you to consider. I think as we move forward, the change that's occurring at the consumer level and at the investor level that's driving claims around how animals are raised, managed, and the associated effects of that, right? Like whether it is carbon, whether it's greenhouse gas, you name it, right? All of those things are how are we going to wrangle that? And I think from a data standpoint, we have an opportunity to take what has been a very private data set and provide a mechanism where you operationally can monetize that from a value proposition. That's going to be a slow arc change, right? It's not going to happen overnight. But if you find a way to monetize the data operationally, everything to the right on the supply chain is gravy at that point, right? Like if it works for you and somehow you can share that data down the stream, and arguably, I think the idea that it becomes private and people aren't willing to share it is the idea that transferring that data has been super hard to date, right? That I think that's part of the problem, is that now that we can digitize data and I can share it with 15 people before I get done working the cattle, that changes how that data can be moved around, versus if it was locked up in a database and I had to have somebody enter it and those type of things. That is a very different data stream than the processing or feed data goes to the goes to the cloud and can be distributed in a marketing organization, and I don't have to do any work. So I think that is how you'll see the more public use of data. It will come with marketing agreements that these brands are making claims around 2030, 2040 and the like, that we're not real sure how they're going to fulfill them.
One of the things I find interesting, Alison, as you mentioned that FDA is monitoring the regulation on the animal side of genomic, and USDA is monitoring the plant side. When it comes to proteins, it's just flipped. When on the alternative proteins, the FDA is monitoring the plant-based proteins and the regulations around the production, and USDA FSIS is doing the food safety on the meat. And so is there a way that when we're in there talking about one side of this, that we can talk about the other and at least have an even playing field?
A lot of it has to do with the underlying regulatory language as to why is a cow with a deletion a drug. A drug is defined as something that alters the form or function of an animal. Okay, not having horns, my form is altered, but the reason you look like and I look like is because of our DNA. So by definition, we're all drugs, right? And so it's kind of this awkward interpretation that that's what it is. That's why they get regulatory jurisdiction over it. The regulation, I think, of cell cultured meats is getting split between the two, because there's a production process that's in the vats, and then there's the meat process that goes over to FSIS, and the reason for that is underlying regulatory jurisdiction. And that basically is what USDA is saying, is we have the authority to regulate genome edited animals under the FSIS approach that's used for plants. And so they're trying to claim that it's not a drug, it's actually, we should be under it. So it's really the underlying regulatory language, and it gets a little bit legal-easy after that. But to me, the problem is when they said a deletion is a drug, to me, it became nonsensical. And so I can maybe buy a transgene which produces a protein as a drug, but natural variation is now a drug. That to me just becomes unworkable, and it just is the end of the story, in my opinion. So I think you have to just go with a different regulatory interpretation of these. And we're the only country in the world that uses that approach. Like, we're out of sync with everybody. And that's a problem.
Thank you for those excellent questions. And thank you again to our speakers in our